Welcome to the Australian Water School, the home of demand-driven industry design training for the global water sector.
It's my great pleasure to welcome you to another outstanding free webinar. This is brought to you by the Australian Water School and today in partnership with Tuflow. And we're going to be talking about maximising the accuracy of hydraulic models with Bill and panellists Chris and Shuang. But more about Bill and Chris and Shuang in a moment. 62 countries, can't believe it. It's absolutely outstanding. It's obviously a topic that gets into people's minds. So that's great, everybody. Thank you for joining us. It's wonderful. Let me introduce to you our presenters and people helping on the Q&A. Bill, come on screen. Bill Syme is with Tuflow. He has 30 years experience in the flood hydraulics field. Tuflow software was developed by Bill starting in 1989. Bill is software business lead, managing Tuflow products and associated services. The widely used Tuflow hydrodynamic modelling software was originally developed by Bill, starting in 1989. Today's, as I said, Bill is the Tuflow business lead. He's also a flood risk consultant. There's probably a lot of things I should say about you, Bill. Chris is the principal engineer in the Tuflow software team with over 15 years experience in the field of hydraulic modelling. Chris has a strong passion for education. He's also an adjunct lecturer at Central Queensland University and guest lectures at the University of Queensland and Monash on hydraulic modelling. So strong education focus there as well as some experience in modelling. Shuang Gao is one of the Tuflow HPC modelling software developers, completed a master's and PhD studies at Tokyo Institute of Technology. Shuang's research at Tokyo Tech focused on 2D large eddy simulation modelling for flow and sediment transport assessments. And Shuang's been instrumental in many of the recent groundbreaking developments in HPC. So I took some time over that. Thanks everybody for listening, and because it's such an incredible team we've got assembled before us. And where are they from? Let me have a look. Bill, you're thousands of k's from where I am, and probably everybody else too.
Absolutely. I'm in Brisbane today.
Right,
yep.
Right. And Chris, you're not far away in Brisbane also in Australia.
I'm in Brisbane.
Right. Yep. And Shuang is located where?
Also in Brisbane, but working from home today.
Right. No, yeah, good one. Yeah, no, look, this is a strong Brisbane showing, and I'm 3,000 k's down the other end of the country over in South Australia. So great to have you. Let's get on with this poll, shall we? And look, thanks everybody for doing this. It just helps Bill and Chris and Shuang. What sector are you from? Pretty much expected. What do you think, Bill, Chris, Shuang?
Yeah, pretty much as expected. Yeah.
Yep. And the second question, what hydraulics modelling software do you use? ECRAS is out there, so is Tuflow. There's the two biggies, and just about 80% of it, 90% of it's covered there. But there's
pretty expected as well. Yeah. Good spread overall though.
Yep. And the third question, how many years hands-on flood modelling experience? None to 5, plus 5, over 5. That's good.
Yeah, good mix.
There. Excellent.
Yeah. Comments there.
I dare say, irrespective of what your experience level is, you'll get something from Bill's presentation.
Fantastic. Yep, that's the way we want to have these webinars. What proportion of your modelling uses an uncalibrated model? Did you expect that?
Probably about right. It's good to see that there's a reasonable proportion of calibration going on, so that's encouraging.
It is.
Because it is hard. Often there's just no data, so you just can't do it.
And there's the last question: how accurate do you think your modelling is? There's a question for you. We chewed over this one before we put it up, everybody. We didn't know whether we should have put this question up, but there's obviously confidence going on here.
Yeah, I think we need to have a show of hands on whoever put up perfect. So.
Right, who did that? Come on screen immediately. Tell us how you do it. Because we all want to know.
Wasn't that you, Bill? Didn't you?
I actually want to employ them. That's what I want.
Shuang and Phil, probably somebody's done this. Perfect. I love that. Hey, Bill's going to be presenting. Chris and Shuang and Phil, another colleague from Tuflow, will be on the Q&A lines waiting for your questions. So, and we won't get through all your questions, but we will have the questions on a file, which we'll make sure we get back to you after the webinar's over, and you'll do do the just answers for things we don't get to after the webinar. Anyway, enough of the intro now. Should we get stuck into this? We've got a lot to get through, and really looking forward to it. So, Bill, I'm going to hand right over to you. No problems. Over to you then, Bill.
Okay, thanks, Trevor, and
Great.
thanks and welcome to everyone for attending this webinar today. It's sort of something I've been, I guess, passionate about for a long time now. So I'm trying to distill some of my thoughts across to you today. So really the focus is on maximising the accuracy of hydraulic models. Just a background for today's webinar. First I'm going to talk about a benchmark model, just background the benchmark model that I'm going to use to demonstrate some of the thoughts that we're going to discuss. And they're going to focus on those topics or thoughts that are going to focus on what about your input data, the different ways you might be able to solve your equations, the influence of parameters such as Manning's N, bend loss values, and on discretisation, which is really how you break up the real world into discrete little elements and cells, or you basically have to convert that real world into a model. I'll just finish off with the importance of testing software and just present an example on that, and then I'll finish up with some recommendations. So maximising the accuracy of your model and being confident about modelling, using a model, is all about minimising your uncertainty. That's really, really what it's all about. And the reason for that is there's just lots and lots of uncertainty in our modelling. It can be in your terrain data, it could be in your land use data and other input data. Your parameters, such as Manning's N, any energy losses you apply, infiltration. There's lots of scope there for variation, so lots of uncertainty potentially. Our boundaries, that's often a big source of uncertainty, not a topic I'll cover a lot today other than on the hydraulic modelling side. But if your flows coming into your model aren't super accurate, then your hydraulic modelling is not going to be super accurate. Your model design, so actually how you structure your model, how you discretize it, can have a big influence on your accuracy of your modelling. And your numerical computation, so that's actually what's happening behind the scenes, how you're solving the equations and the options you have to do that. So it's not to present a doom and gloom story here, but basically there are lots of uncertainties, and as modelers we need to be on top of all those and have a feel, if you like, for the effect of those. And this is a bit of a journey, I suppose. When I think about when I first started modelling, probably 35 years ago, where I thought models were just perfect. Today, of course, I don't think that. And we've what's been really sweet is the TUFLOW 2020 release of HPC. It's got to a point where we've got a piece of software that can really model everything from a flume to large catchment to major rivers, using industry standard Manning's N values, the same turbulence model without having to adjust parameters. It's got brilliant cell size results convergence, particularly if you're using subgrid sampling. Time stepping doesn't affect results. And it's got a very nice second order numerical solver, not affected by numerical diffusion or error accumulation. And so you can really punch in, if you start a model, you can punch in just run with industry standard parameters. And if you're calibrating, you should be pretty close to the mark. Otherwise, something else is wrong. But it's been really nice to get to this sort of point. And you can really be, if you don't have calibration, you can be very confident about your results. It's the situation we're in today. So let's get into the presentation. The first thing I'm going to just run you through is this benchmark model, which I'm going to repeatedly show results from. And what I was after for this benchmark model was a real world model that exhibits that has been well calibrated. So there's a lot of confidence in this accuracy, ideally quick to run, but also has very challenging hydraulics inside it. And after 35 years of seeing studies, both internally and externally, you can't really go past the Brisbane River flood study completed in 2016. It really did push the limits in terms of how exhaustive that calibration was, and how, I guess, the achievement of the calibration in terms of the hydraulic modelling. So just to locate Brisbane, here we have Australia. This is Brisbane in here. This is the Brisbane River catchment, quite a large one of our major East Coast river systems. There's a very large dam halfway down the Brisbane River called Wivenhoe Dam. And this area here is our hydraulic model. So that's the extent of the model, which is, it's large, it's big, and takes a long time to run. So it's not ideal for a benchmark model, but this data set is potentially the source of a great benchmark model. And the flood we're going to focus on today is actually the one in 2011, which actually spurred this, this study to happen and to really make a big impact on how floodplains are managed in this part of the world. It was close to a 100-year flood, certainly down in Brisbane around that level. In this catchment here is about 140-year. This Brisbane River catchment was a smaller flood. So, but the effect was we ended up having a major flood in Brisbane of around a 1 in 100 AUP flood. The study, it was an exhaustive calibration. There's thousands of flood marks, 30 gauges within the hydraulic modelling area. It was calibrated to the tide. It was calibrated to 3 minor floods from about 1 in 10 to 1 in 20, and 2 major floods, both around the 1 in 100. So that's 5 floods of different size. And what was critical was to come up with a model which used the same parameters for all events. There are no event-specific parameters, because we were modelling lots of Monte Carlo simulations were done on this study. So you're modelling events from a tiny event up to extreme events. So you had to be confident about your parameters. So this study is about as good as it gets when it comes to a calibrated model. So what we've decided to do is to make a little benchmark model, which sort of cut this section of the model out. There it is there. And just to make a model that's quick to run, it's got some pre-testing hydraulics and good to use. Here it is here, it's about 11 kilometres stretch. It actually goes through the Brisbane CBD. The Brisbane CBD is here. Most of it's on high ground, fortunately. It's got 6 reaches in it and 5 bends. And this is actually rock. So these bends are pretty sharp. They're not in a big alluvial floodplain. So it's a pretty hard bend here. And yeah, the water gets pretty wild. There's 8 bridges through the side. Those bridges are at the size of the 2011 flood are all clear spanning pretty much. So it's only pier losses we're having to deal with in this situation. Within this reach, there are 13 good flood marks, as shown there in red. That's the flood level that was recorded, those red numbers. There's a gauge here at the city gauge. I'll show some results at that city gauge. What's also quite interesting is things like super elevation. So across this bend here, we're getting roughly 0.7 of a metre difference in flood level. And that's because the water comes around the outside of the bend and surcharges on the outside. So that's pretty strong hydraulic effects that are happening there. The model developed for the flood study was a 30-metre fixed grid. So we've just adopted that same resolution for this model. And for the boundaries, we've just extracted those from the big model, the regional model. So we've taken an inflow here and a water level boundary here at the outflow. So we've got a nice little sweet model. And one of the reasons this is so appealing is, and so has such low uncertainty in terms of what we're working with, is we've got high resolution accurate terrain and bathymetry data. There's actually unusually, this is the really nice thing, there's little uncertainty over flood flows. So these graphs are hard to see, but on the right here we have flow versus time at a bridge 22 kilometres upstream, still in Brisbane urban area. And those little blue dots are flow measurements using ADCP recordings. There's a couple down here as well. The green and red lines are from the modelling for the flood study. So you can see here they've measured around the peak, 9,500 to 10,000 cubic meters a second is the range. So you can see even measurements are never perfect. You've got conflicting amounts there, but it's very, very rare for a flood of this size to have high quality flow data to cross-check your modelling. So that's pretty special. And this is water level on the right. So these are the water levels they've measured at the time of the flow gauging. So you can just see it there. So that ADCP recordings really is the icing on the cake in terms of having confidence about this data set. So here's the benchmark model. Let's start looking. The first thing we need to do is actually check that it actually calibrates. And that's a little bit complicated because the original flood study was done using TwoFlow Classic in 2016. That's an implicit matrix solver. It's got back then it was Maximising plus constant turbulence model. And a Manning's N of about 0.022 for this main waterway, it's a tidal waterway, was found to give the best calibration for that range of floods that we're looking at. For the benchmark model, we're running TwoFlow HPC 2020. It's an explicit solver. It's got a different turbulence model as by default. And it also has subgrid sampling. And it needs a Manning's N of 0.025 to get an equivalent calibration. So you can see here, the red numbers are the recorded, the blue numbers are the modeled. So you can see it's quite a good match coming through there within a centimeter in a lot of these cases. So, yeah, it's interesting in itself where you do need a slightly different Manning's N because different solver, different turbulence model, but also subgrid sampling tends to make the system a bit more fluid. So you may need a slightly higher Manning's N to compensate for that compared to not using subgrid sampling. So that's the peak water levels there. We also can plot up the longitudinal profile down the system. So this is at the top of the benchmark model down to the bottom. You have the bed level. So you can see how much, this is along the deepest part of the river. So you can see how much this bed elevation varies. And there's actually rock ledges in some places. That's the nature of this Brisbane River, very steep system. So yeah, that looks quite nice, but of course we might want to zoom into that. Here's the city gauge, so with the 0.025. So that's a nice calibration. If we just zoom into that longitudinal profile, so what I'm displaying now is, that's the profile there. You can see the pluses are water levels that were recorded on the outside of the bend. So you would expect them to be above the water level down the center line. The minus symbols are the water levels on the inside of a bend. And the squares are on straight sections of the river. So you want to be fairly close to those if you can. So I'll be displaying this longitudinal profile numerous times during this presentation. So that's what you're seeing is those marks. Get some interesting effects, as I mentioned the super elevation earlier across there. You even get a bit of a rise in flood level occasionally. And it's an interesting one here that I'll probably just touch on a bit later. Because as the velocity slows down, your dynamic or kinetic energy converts back to potential energy, and you can actually get a rise in flood level in some places. So that's why this looks a bit up and down. It's actually not unstable at all. That's just, if you zoom into those sections, they're just a rise and fall of the river as the velocity ebbs and flows, basically, as it goes, not ebbs and flows, but it goes, increases and decreases. So basically, we've got a little benchmark model that's reproducing reality with a high level of confidence using industry guideline parameters. So that's exactly what I wanted. So now I'm going to move on to input data. Let's just explore that, how that can affect your accuracy of your modeling. So what if you started this little study and you didn't have any terrain or bathymetric data? You had no budget to carry out these surveys, but you found online that you could actually download a DEM, and even better, it was for free. And it actually looks okay as well, particularly when you zoom out, it looks amazing. So cool, that's fantastic. But the bathymetry needed to be sorted out, and we found some bathymetric data as well. when you start looking at the bathymetric data, which is on a 100-meter grid, this is from the same download side, it looks a bit rough. So I'd be a bit pessimistic, but at least it's deeper than what the land-based survey had, which didn't really go much below the waterline. Okay, so let's feed that data in and run the model. Model runs fine, absolutely fine, but it is horribly, horribly wrong. This is the results from that little model with the free data downloaded. There's a choke point there. And so then that will be in the terrain data. That's just the model's just doing what you've asked it to do. Here's the Brisbane city gauge. It's like 5 meters above the actual recorded value. And you can see the Thalweg of the bathymetry there. It's sitting much higher than what was actually there in reality. So you have to be very careful about the data you put in. We even tried to calibrate this scenario, and there's your Manning's N of 0.025, there's your Manning's N of 0.01, and even if you made your Manning's N 0.001, the model starts to get a bit sensitive, as you can imagine. You can't come close to the peak, so it's almost impossible to calibrate this model with that data, which is a good thing because you're feeding terrible data into it. And it's simply wrong just because that input data is inaccurate. It has a high level of uncertainty, has a high vertical error. And look, it's quite simple. You feed garbage into your model, you'll get garbage out. So I just can't stress enough the importance of feeding high quality data into your model if you want to have an accurate model. That's your baseline, that's your starting point. So I'm now going to move on to the next section, which is on solving the fluid flow equations. Something we all love, I'm sure. So here's one form of the equations. This is the momentum equation in 2D form. And they're all the terms or forces or things that can make water, affect how water moves around. Inertia, gravity obviously pushes water down. Inertia will make it run up. Coriolis force actually can influence, that's the Earth's rotation, can influence how the water moves around. Bed resistance slows the water down. So that's typically a Manning's equation for most people. Atmospheric pressure can affect how water moves around, like for a cyclone or a hurricane. Turbulence comes into play when you have very fast, rapidly changing velocities. And you might have some external forces on the water as well. Now, these equations can be derived or rewritten in various different spatial dimensions. So 1D, 2D, 3D layered, or the full CFD Navier-Stokes equations. So that's one way, one thing you'll see, obviously, in the industry, 1D, 2D, 3D. But there's also quite a number of different ways that these equations can be sort of represented, if you like. So the simplest is the kinematic wave, which is effectively just the bed resistance, the Manning's equation, and nothing more. If we add gravity to that, you end up with a diffusive wave equation. If we add inertia to that, you've got a dynamic wave situation without the turbulence term. And that's probably fine for slow-moving hydraulics. Basically, we don't ever recommend using kinematic wave or diffusive wave for hydraulic models. But if you've just got generally slow-moving hydraulics, like out in the floodplain, that's probably fine not to have the turbulence term in there. Inertia would also be nice. You may get away with the diffusive wave. Next level is a dynamic wave where we've added the turbulence term in, or some people refer to as eddy viscosity. And that's sort of the level you want to be at for flood hydraulics. And if you're into the coastal side of things, you often need to add the pressure term and Coriolis for coastal hydraulics. So you have these different forms of that equation there. And then there's different numerical solution approaches, simple or advanced, and I'll discuss those in a bit more in a second. So there's lots of variations. There's many ways to solve these equations, as I've just sort of been explaining, and no two solutions will give identical results. That's the first thing to realize. You'll never get the same results giving two different solvers. And that's simply because there is no exact answer for real-world high flows. So we need to approximate and extrapolate when we're solving those equations. In terms of numerically solving these equations, there's two common approaches in use, and that tends to be what we call first order and second order. I'm just going to refer to those as simple and advanced, because effectively that's what they are. The simple one is much more simple mathematics, and the advanced is more complicated mathematics. Trying to explain the difference between those two is if we're trying to determine how the velocity of water is moving over time. And this is where we were on our last calculation. So we had estimated at this point in the system, we're moving at 1 meter per second. And then we need to move forward in time. So in other words, a time step. You'll often hear about time steps in hydraulic modeling. And this is the exact answer, but of course we don't know that. We don't know what the exact answer is for these equations, particularly for complex flows. And so the simplest solution approach is effectively, if you like, the analogy is a straight line projection estimate, and hopefully you'll come close to hitting that. But it doesn't hit it that accurately in some cases. And so that error can cause a buildup of inaccurate results. The advanced solution, the second order, is more like fitting a parabola to 3 points as opposed to a straight line. And that is, generally speaking, in free surface hydraulics, the error is very, very negligible. But there's always going to be potential for some very minor error. But we tend to find that second order level is fine for this type of work. So let's look at some results using those two different simple and advanced approaches. So here's fluid flow. This is just a nice steady state uniform flow case. So because the velocity it's just steady state and velocity isn't changing much as it goes down, the inertia is zero, the turbulence is zero, it's just gravity and friction. And basically this should completely obey the Manning's equation. So in this situation, it does have an exact solution. And you can see here, we've got 4 different results actually plotted up here. This is the bed or the channel. This is the water surface in a profile, longitudinal profile. And there's 4 results there. They all lie exactly on top of each other. And there's a simple solution with no turbulence, simple with turbulence, advanced with no turbulence, and advanced with turbulence. So that's exactly what should be happening. They should give identical answers. Now, unfortunately, the real world isn't as simple as that, and we tend to have much more complex hydraulics. And the Brisbane River is a very, very good example of that. High velocities, typically 3, 4, 5 meters per second, and ripping around these bends. And so the resistance to flow, or Manning's equation, is proportional to velocity squared. Very important to realize that. So the higher the velocities, the more important these terms become. There's lots of changing with symmetry, as I showed earlier with those rock shelves and the bends. So they both contribute to having very strong inertia and turbulence effects. So let's run this little cut down model using a simple and advanced solution. In this case, using 2 for HVC, which has both a first order and a second order option available. So here's what I showed earlier. This is the calibration, so matching the marks quite nicely. And this is exactly the same data set. Everything is identical except we're running a first order solution, a simple solution. So you can see that the flood levels are all elevated. So what typically first order tends to do, or simple numerics tends to do, is to accumulate errors, often referred to as numerical diffusion, and it tends to overestimate the gradient. So you've got to be careful at certain times about the numerical solver. Let's move on to the next section, which is the Manning's end value. So why don't we try and calibrate that simple solution? So if we reduce the Manning's end from 0.025 down to 0.018, we pull that profile down, and it's actually now giving quite a good calibration. And at the city gauge, it's actually giving quite a nice calibration. The problem, though, is that 0.018 is getting a very, very slippery value for a tidal river. Typically 0.02 to 0.025, 0.03 is the sort of value you would expect. 0.025 is pretty much in the sweet spot. And so 0.018, while it might give a good calibration, is not within industry guidelines. And that has implications for when you're modeling smaller events for the same river system and modeling more extreme events. So effectively, that more simple numeric solution is unable to accurately resolve the inertia and turbulence, and it's really not suited to when you're having complex hydraulics such as we've got in the Brisbane River. And look, the moral of the story here is if N values are outside the industry guidelines, industry norms, then something is wrong. So you really need to take things further. So just some recommendations around Manning's N. That really has to be within industry standard or industry guidelines. Typically 1D and 2D N values should be very similar. Except there's one exception to that, because sometimes the Manning's N value, particularly for 1D models, is used to help or is increased to approximate 2D and 3D energy losses around bend structures, flow expansions. So if the Manning's N is a proxy for energy loss, then of course you'll see quite significant differences between 1D and 2D. So, as I said before, if it's outside industry guidelines, something is wrong. It could be inaccurate data, as we saw with feeding in that free DEM data earlier, or it could be just that you're using a first order solution. Another really good thing to do with Manning's N is just sensitivity test it. So here's that, here's the model run, the second order one, this advanced one run with a 0.03 and a 0.02. So you can sort of see the effect of Manning's N. So that bound that can develop there can give you a bit of an idea about the uncertainty in your modeling if you didn't have calibration data and you needed to get a handle on that. Let's now discuss briefly bend losses. So bend losses, are they different for 1D and 2D? And look, the answer to that is yes. And it's really quite important to understand that around a bend, you'll have energy losses, and that is proportional to V squared. So where you get high velocities, this starts to really become an issue. So once again, the Brisbane River, this is actually from the earlier Brisbane River flood study. So we've got 3 to 4 meters per second around here, 20 meters deep, 0.7 meters super elevation. So 1D equations have no idea that that bend is there, because that's like a straight line. It may look like those cross sections from a 1D model going around the bend, but they're not. As far as the model is concerned, it's just a straight line. It's got tunnel vision. And so 1D equations cannot simulate that bend loss. So you have to apply an additional loss or a higher Manning's N around a bend like this to actually get anything close to the correct answer. 2D equations, they actually do simulate much of the losses that go around here because they can model what happens when water bends around like that. But they won't simulate all the losses because there'll be losses in the vertical. Water actually rotates as it goes around the bend like this. It's what they call heterocoidal flow. So you will actually have losses in the vertical as well as in plane. So 2D should simulate most of the losses, but not all. Of course, if you have the luxury of being able to model this in 3D, you should start to not need any additional energy losses. But we're not at 3D yet, not for these flood studies. So when it comes to bend losses, the recommendations are along these lines. 1D and 2D will differ because 1D needs to represent 2D and 3D effects, whereas 2D bend losses need to represent just the additional 3D effects in the vertical. If your bends are in a gentle bends through an alluvial floodplain, which a lot of river systems, that's the case, the 1D may need to be slightly higher than with using a slightly higher Manning's N or an energy loss or form loss. But 2D, we've generally found you don't need to add any bend losses. It's only when you get to bends which are controlled by rocks, such as Brisbane River. So these are the sort of values that came out of Brisbane Rivers about lots, about 20 or 30 bends where we had good calibration data, and we found that using a K value of these sort of magnitude for those types of bends controlled by rock for 1D and for 2D, you can see the 2D values are quite a bit smaller. That worked quite nicely. Similarly, for major rock obstructions in the river, there's a similar story. So there's a bit of guidance for you in terms of bend losses coming out of a well documented, highly calibrated study. Let's now talk about discretization. So that's about how you break your real world up into lots of little cells and elements. So it's also about time stepping. I just have one slide here on the temporal discretization. That's how you step through time in discrete jumps. And look, this is pretty straightforward. Basically, it's a good test to do, but most models are pretty fine. So if you halve your time step, for example, as I've shown here, these are two runs sitting on top of each other. Basically, the blue line is the full time step and the yellow line is the half of that. And look, the results, you can't tell the difference. So that's what you are after. So if you do get a difference in result, that's not a good sign. Investigate further or use another software. But it's always good to do a bit of a time step test every now and then just to be comfortable with that. There's no error being brought in due to that. Occasionally, you may need to wind the main time step down a bit if you've got really complex hydraulics. Spatial discretization, this is the big one. So this is where we break our model up. So we could have this model at a 100 meter cell size, a 50, a 30, a 20, and a 10 meter cell size. And what we're after here is if we change this model between those different discretizations, does that change our results? Because if it is, we have a problem. So let's look at results convergence for that case. As I said, looking for little change in results. So this is that benchmark model run. So the yellow is a 100 meter grid. Now I should just add this is with subgrid sampling turned on. So 100 meter grid, yeah, that's not really, it's just too coarse. Even with subgrid sampling, it's way too coarse. That's 50 meter, it's getting closer. And then 30, 20, and 10 pretty well sit on top of each other. So that's very comforting. So this is a convergence chart. So this is cell size on the bottom. So there's your 100 meter, your 50, your 30, your 20, and a 10. This is the water, the gauge level was here. That's what we're targeting. And so you can see there that 30, 20, or 10 are giving a great result. So running a model at 30 meters is absolutely fine. Now, let's just see what effect subgrid sampling has. So same deal again. So without subgrid sampling, you're seeing a bigger divergence. And that's understandable because each of these 100 meter cells gone from having lots of elevations to source from to one elevation per cell, and similar for the 50. So you can see the convergence is much delayed. But when you get down to 20, 10 meters, you're getting a nice convergence in results. So subgrid sampling certainly helps this process. Let's rerun that model with the simple and advanced solutions. So here's the advanced or second order solution, very nice convergence. Here's the simple solution. It's still converging. So you really, yeah, not great. So not only does the simple solution over predict things, but it really struggles in terms of convergence, even if you're using subgrid sampling. Yeah, so be aware of all that. Let's talk about boundaries just briefly. So boundaries, look, I won't dwell on this, but basically there's a bit of advice there. What you feed into your boundary is often one of the major sources of inaccuracies. That's a whole webinar in itself. But what you need to do as a hydraulic model is just check the performance. So for example, this boundary here is not performing well. It's got a circulation developing on it, which will be distorting results. And that's simply due to that boundary not being digitized particularly well. So if it's digitized across the river, you get a nice result. So that's the main thing from a hydraulic modeling point of view. Just check your boundaries. Now, structures, I'm not planning to talk about structures in this presentation. We've got a webinar scheduled for 20th of October, which will be solely on structures. It really is a whole webinar in itself. So please watch out for that one. Now, finally, I'm just going to run through an example of testing your software. So it's really important when you're testing or using a piece of software that you understand its limitations. So let's apply this benchmark model to another commonly used hydraulic modeling software. And in the interest of simplicity and like-for-like comparison of how the 2D equations are solved, we've had to take out the bridges. There's 8 bridges in there, and just take out those additional bend losses just to sort of have everything on the same sort of playing field, if you like. And out of interest, we also did some runs removing turbulence just to see what would happen. And these are the simulations here. So this is the calibrated one, the blue line. The yellow line is after removing the additional 3D losses at the bends. The pink line is after we've removed the bridges. And the green line is what happens if you remove the turbulence term. It gets a bit wild, actually, a little bit out of control there. But what was quite interesting with this little exercise is that the total head loss from upstream to downstream for this benchmark model is 3.69 meters. About 6% of that was due to those additional losses, so quite small at the bends. That's for the 3D losses, and that's probably what you'd probably expect. The 8 bridges, removing those contributed to about 12% of the total head loss. And you have to remember these are just pier losses, and some of the bridges the piers hardly affect the flow at all because they're on the river banks. They're clear spanning bridges. But the total loss from the 8 bridges is 0.43 of a metre, or 12%. Remove turbulence, that contributed around 22% of the head drop, 0.8 of a metre. But clearly, and Manning's was 60%. So that's the main, as you would expect, that's the main contributor. So this other 2D solver, it's one that's commonly used for flood modelling. It's a dynamic fluid flow equation, new explicit solver. It's got subgrid sampling, and we've just run that solver with the defaults. We took no bridges, no bend losses, similar cell size, just to get a feel, how things look. So this is the result. So the dotted line is a calibrated model with all the bridges and the bend losses in there. The pink line is after you've taken the bridges and the bend losses out. But this other solver is the yellow line. So it has pumped up the levels above this pink line here. So that really is saying that it's over predicting the head loss by about 1 metre, 30%. And what's quite interesting is I've also added to that chart above the green line, which is the simple or first order solution from 2Flow, without the bridges and without the bend losses. So it's giving a fairly similar gradient, actually, amazingly similar. So I suspect that this other solver has a similar sort of simplistic first order solution, which isn't really suited to this situation of having pretty complex hydraulics. Let's look at cell size convergence. So this is the other solver. And so we've gone from an 80 metre to 50 to 30 to 20 to 10. And it's not converging at all. This is it here. This is 2Flow HPC advanced solver without the bridges and without the bend loss, the tiny bend losses. So it's still converging nicely, whereas this other solver is not at all. So that does not give you any confidence at all whatsoever in that solver for modeling that type of flow. Okay, so to wrap up, some recommendations. I'm just going to have a few slides to finish off with. And I'm going to be talking about storage dominated areas. And what I'm talking about here is large floodplains, lakes, tidal flats, where the water's moving very slowly, basically. So big floodplains. Here's some guys in 2011 flood. There's a hand there. Not sure that was photoshopped in, but it's certainly appropriate. So that's the sort of storage dominated areas that I'm talking about. And I'm also talking about conveyance dominated areas. And that's where your water is really moving. And that's a completely different ballpark. So conveyance dominated areas is much more complex. And that's your primary flow paths, and certainly around things like structures and rock obstructions and buildings and so forth. Now, how do you identify these two different types of behaviors, if you like? One type of mapping I love looking at is unit flow, which is what we call small q, which is depth times the velocity in 2D world. So where you have a high q, which is this red here, that's your conveyance dominated part of your model. Very different hydraulics to your storage dominated area, which is the low q, which is the blue space. So look, map up your Q and have a good look. And recommendations on these different types of areas is, look, storage is, elevations still need to be very accurate. Your DEMs need to be accurate. But what you're really out trying to capture is the storage. You don't care about areas that start off wet, because below that isn't actually used. What we want is a change in storage as the flood rises. You want reasonable representation of flow paths, but not as critical as for conveyance dominated. Obviously, embankments, to control how water moves around, you need to have those embankment crests in there as break lines. Yeah, just run with industry standard Manning's N values. Look, a simple first order solution would probably suffice. Even the diffusive wave solution would probably suffice in a lot of these areas. Because basically the turbulence and inertia terms have no influence or minor influence and are not critical. So a lot of those schemes are fine in this sort of space. And look, and larger cell size can often be used. Subgrid sampling is always beneficial. For conveyance dominated areas, you really need to have very good terrain bathymetric elevations, because if you don't get that flow area correct, you won't come close to getting your hydraulics correct. You need to be using industry norms for Manning's N values. You will probably need to focus on any bend losses at sharp bends or submerged obstructions, taking to the advice given earlier. Definitely always want to have good representation of structures, because the flow is trying to squeeze through those structures. In terms of embankments overtopping, that's always important. You definitely need to be running with a quality advanced second order solver with a good turbulence model. That's absolutely essential. And you want to be reproducing the velocities well. And we saw that, like, going to a 100-meter grid on the Brisbane River just doesn't do that. So you need to be getting down to find enough cell size to have good reproduction of your velocities. Subgrid sampling, beneficial as always. And make sure you carry out cell size results convergence testing. That's really, really important. Okay, let's wrap up. So maximizing the accuracy of your hydraulic model is basically achieved by having accurate terrain, bathymetric elevations, also good land use data. Subgrid sampling helps. 3D break lines are essential to make sure you get the hydraulic controls in there in place. Run with your Manning's N values as per normal. Don't use Manning's N values outside their norms. If that is the case, if you're calibrating and you've got a strange Manning's N value, something else is wrong. And those Manning's N values won't necessarily apply to simple first order solutions if you've got complex hydraulics. You may need energy losses at rocks and bends, and there's some recommendations on those further as I've given them previously. Hydraulic structures essentially need to be well represented. Watch out for our webinar in October. And if you want a second order or advanced solution, dynamic wave, really, really, really important for your conveyance dominated areas. And do your cell size results convergence testing. It almost should be a mandatory test. Thank you.
What a fantastic presentation, Bill. We're just in awe. I'm not a modeler, but I can understand that that this would apply to this material would apply to somebody's brand new modeler or a longer term modeler. Thanks so much for that. That's been absolutely fantastic. And the team, Two Flow team's been going flat out in the background answering the questions, and there's still many to go. Thank you to Chris, Xuan, and Phil in the background there, the Tuflo team working hard. So good to see you again, Phil, and thanks, Chris. I'll hand over to you to manage this next section with Q&A, and who should answer them, and what questions you think might be best to attack first. We obviously don't want to get through all of them, or we may. Well, let's have a go. Yep.
Awesome. Thanks, Trevor. Whilst the questions have been coming through, I've just been copying across a few into a Word document that I thought the audience might benefit from hearing Bill, Phil, and Xuan's thoughts on. So let's work through those now. First one. Can we rely on results in situations where the water depth is greater than the 2D cell size when doing 2D modelling, in brackets, shallow water equations?
Yes, so the answer to that is you can now with Tuflo HPC 2020 because of this new turbulence model. Anyone interested, there's a nice paper that Greg Collicott, who developed Tuflo HPC, presented at the IAHR Riverflow 2020 conference, virtually, of course. But that's a peer-reviewed paper where he discusses the need to change to this new turbulence model to allow us to go to cell sizes below, to have much larger depths compared to the cell size. It also allows us to go down to flume scale modeling without having to modify our turbulence parameters. So that's been a huge thing. And you can now model with confidence at those much deeper depths compared to your cell size.
Thanks, Bill. The next one I have here, I've actually answered this online, so I'd be keen to hear what Bill says to see if it's in agreement with what I said. Not a modeler, but a procurer of modelling. Is it off topic to ask for suggestions on how to optimise specifications, setting reasonable expectations of accuracy? Is it just a function of doing the contributing components well? Would you like me to tell you what my answer was, and you can say if it's right or not?
Well, I think it's off topic to request that. I think what's really important as someone who's receiving the results from hydraulic modelling, or maybe overseeing our study, is that they work with the people doing the modelling to appreciate where the uncertainties lie. But if you, as I've said through this presentation, if you're feeding in good quality data, you're using a good quality scheme, you've done tests such as cell size convergence testing to make sure there's no effects there. If you just carry through and do those basic tests, you can get a bit of an idea of uncertainty by doing a plus or minus on either your Manning's N or your inflows. Then you're going to be in a pretty good space. But as you see, you can also run with schemes that may not be suited to the hydraulics you're trying to model. And that's really dangerous territory.
Okay, thanks. Next one is, can you comment on using different Manning's Ns values for 1D versus 2D versus 3D?
Yeah, now I had two slides which I took out last minute on this. Probably, what I'll do is I'll include those slides, those dot points in the PDFs that will be issued of this presentation. I'll make sure they're in there. But basically, so 1D and 2D Manning's N should not change much, except when you get to bends. Because often, particularly for 1D, Manning's N is elevated or increased to help model the bend losses. But typically what we see in many models, and I've been calibrating models for a long time now, is that if you can separate out things like bend losses or losses from ledges and stuff. I mean, there's some very interesting stuff that came out of the Brisbane River flood study on this, because Phil, in fact, developed a 1D model, a pure 1D model of that system for the Monte Carlo analysis, and it had a brilliant calibration, but it just needed those extra high bend losses and a slightly higher loss along the river where the rock ledges were. So interesting. But I'll include those slides, and if anyone has any questions on that, just please feel free to contact Tuflo support.
Okay, next one here. Beyond differences in terms of length of modelling time, is there any benefit of using an explicit model like Tuflo HPC compared to an implicit model? in terms of accuracy?
Well, there's very little difference between two-flow HPC and two-flow classic. In fact, that was sort of, those who have been modeling two-flow for a while might remember the first incarnation of two-flow HPC, which was called two-flow GPU. And that was a very simple first order scheme that we just were exploring the use of using GPU cards. But it had, as time went on, we realized that it was not as accurate as two-flow classic, which is a second order implicit scheme. And that really came down to what you saw with that HPC first order results that I showed. It tends to over-predict the gradient. And so it's not really whether it's explicit or implicit. It's more about how accurate the solution is in terms of the mathematics. So that's much, much more important. So a good quality explicit scheme will give you similar results to good quality implicit scheme.
There's been two questions actually asking about the form losses that get applied at bends, and in particular, where you might find information to define that where you'd find guidance.
Well,
numbers.
When we did the Brisbane River flood study, as Phil will remember, we it was a real challenge, and we actually went searching for that guidance because there was a lot of bends in that system, and they're hard bends. They're not, it's not a alluvial plain. They're not rounded bends, and we just couldn't find anything at all. It's very, very hard. And so what has come out of that study is some very good guidelines, and the numbers that I put in that slide are from the Brisbane River flood study. So if you do have a very sharp 180-degree bend, you could definitely run with the sort of numbers that we used. And that's all documented in that study. And look, if anyone wants some tables from that report, I'm sure we could dig those out. We'll head you towards those. But that's, I would say, is without doubt the best guidance that I've ever seen. And that's come from a very in-depth calibration exercise.
Okay.
And for both 1D and 2D, I should add there. So we've got numbers there for both types of models.
There was a question which is subsequently, I think, moved over to answered. Maybe Phil or Schwein answered it online. But someone did ask, when did HPC move from first order to second order? So
so when we went from what we call two-flow GPU to two-flow HPC was when it happened. And we made the default second order. So that was the 2018 release. Now, the difference between 2018 and 2020 is the new turbulence model and subgrid sampling. So those things have really important benefits. But you can bind back. You can still use this Megrensky constant arrangement if you want to. But that's the difference. Yeah, that's when it happened.
One of the nice things in the way that Bill and Phil and Schwein have configured two-flow is if you're working on a study which requires past defaults, you can still use new versions of two-flow, but just use a pre-defaults flag and it'll backdate all of the default parameters to prior years if you do need to go back there. But yeah. Let's see. Someone asked here, for subgrid sampling, as a rule of thumb, should we go 1/3 of the cell size of the computational grid to at least get 3 points within each cell to get a curve relative to the cell size?
Subgrid sampling, the frequency at which you sample should probably be commensurate with the resolution of your underlying data. So if you've got a 20-meter cell size and you've got a 1-meter DEM sitting underneath it, you should be sampling around that 20 mark. It's not a lot of benefit sampling at a higher frequency. So that's, you maximize the data that's being presented by the DEM. And so sample at the resolution of your source data.
And Bill, is there any extra computational overhead moving from, say, sampling at 3 points versus 20 points?
Yeah, it might be a bit slower on the startup. I mean, Phil, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, there will be a little bit more overhead in the pre-processing of the input data by having a higher resolution. There is actually an upper limit, which I think is 127 samples per face or 16,000 samples per cell. Once we get there, you know, we actually cap it to that, and you probably do need to maybe look at reducing your cell size if you want to capture more than 16,000 points in a cell. You are still only, you know, capturing the hydraulics at that cell resolution. But yeah, certainly, yeah, we're looking at going something close to what your DEM resolution is.
There's a question here. I expect you would recommend depth varying roughness as opposed to constant roughness. If I just expand that question a little bit more, Bill, Phil, could you comment on the different situations when you could benefit from moving to depth varying versus just sticking with a constant roughness value?
Yeah, I mean, depth varying certainly has its place, particularly, well, there could be a strong argument for it. For example, if you've got, say, very dense vegetation that flattens or is well and truly inundated, so at larger depths, it's much easier for the water to go when it goes over the top of the vegetation. So that would be one example. There's obviously, it's used in, those who might remember Phil's direct rainfall webinar, you can use it to sort of represent buildings in different ways. So there are certainly cases for it. Generally speaking, well, it depends. For direct rainfall models, it definitely needs to be on the agenda. For just your classic sort of river model, probably not. We didn't find that with the Brisbane River any great need to vary Maximising depth. There's other things at play, which such as the turbulence model and whatever, that are probably much more important as your depths get much greater than your cell size for those extreme events. So
the other thing with depth varying roughness is the guidance for depth varying roughness is often very specific to particular types of vegetation and things like that. You know, someone might have done a master's or something looking in a particular type of vegetation, and there's great guidance for that. But more generally, that there's not necessarily a huge amount of guidance for general land use types and what the depth varying roughness might be. But yeah, barring direct rainfall, that would be certainly a great use case of depth varying Mannings.
A few people have asked what the other solver is. Bill, I've typed it a few times that we actually won't be.
Yeah, no, I mean, the intent is not to say what the other solver is. The intent is to just get across the importance of testing your software. That's really what I want to get into people's minds, is that no two schemes, you can have two schemes that say they both solve the 2D equations. And I've seen schemes that say that, which are just a 1D equation over a 2D grid. I mean, which is completely wrong, if you like. So there's a lot of smoke and mirrors out there. So look, the intent with that is that you get, it's just important to understand that no two solvers are the same. There are times when they'll give very similar results or identical results when it comes to nice uniform flow. And there are times such as the Brisbane River where they won't. And yeah, so you just have to appreciate the limitations of your solver. And that was the purpose of that exercise.
Someone has asked specifically for HPC, does it correctly model flow over a weir in the 2D domain?
So yes, it models, it has, like all things, an approximation to weir flow. It's built in by defaults to the raw crested weir formula in terms of doing that. Shuang has been doing more work on that to allow us to adjust that. So someone had like a sharp edge weir in a 2D domain and they didn't want to do that in 1D. There'll be more options coming out in hopefully the 2021 release around that. So you can get a reasonable approximation, but like all things, it is an approximation. But it's certainly fine for if you're happy with the broad crested weir arrangement.
I see we're sort of getting on with the time. I'll just list maybe two more questions, and then we'll cover the rest after the fact when we provide answers in the PDF document. Let's see, these ones will just focus on boundary conditions. Can you comment on uncertainties in hydrology and flows, particularly for longer river modelling And do you use flow as a calibration parameter for sensitivity analysis?
Yeah, flow. Look, it varies a lot. In the Brisbane River, we are very lucky because half the catchment is above Wivenhoe Dam, so we knew pretty well, very precisely how much water was coming through that point of the catchment. Plus, they did the flow gauging, and so there was little uncertainty, or about as good as you'll get. But a lot of flood models suffer from the hydrology being very approximate, and there's very good reasons for that. It's a very complex process. The hydrology may not be calibrated itself. The rainfall, that particularly for historical events, you might have no gauges within the catchment or just one gauge in the catchment, and the rainfall obviously didn't fall the same over the whole catchment. So there's a lot of uncertainty there. I think the way you've just got to try, and the uncertainty will be linked to whether it's calibrated or not, linked to whether the variation in the rainfall, if there's unknowns around that. And then I think doing a plus or minus on the flow is a good exercise. I think in the UK they do a plus or minus 20% as a fairly standard test, just to get a feel for that uncertainty. And so if there's a lot of uncertainties, you may just have to be conservative in taking the higher side. Particularly if you're doing it for a planning study and you're setting floor levels, always aim for the higher side.
Okay, last question. This is really just talking about model schematization. I'd probably like to know how you would approach this one. Okay, what is the best downstream condition for a river? For example, if we have a river that ends in a lagoon, we have tidal levels, and we have a water level gauge about 2 to 3 kilometres upstream of the river mouth. Is it accurate to use the tidal levels at the downstream boundary, or do we need to model the coastal hydraulics as well?
I think if you've got a gauge and you've got good data, that's fine to have your boundary at that point. Absolutely fine. In fact, that little cut down model is exactly that. It wasn't a gauge, but the boundary was taken out of the regional model, and that ran that little cut down model in a tidal frame before and after the main flood. Absolutely fine. So if you've got good data at a gauge, I would just cut the model at that point. That sort of boundary's got fairly little uncertainty associated with it. If you don't have a gauge, then you probably need to run the model right through to the ocean, and because there you would have much more precise information about your boundary.
And one of the downsides in extending that further out is that there's often a lot of morphological processes happening, particularly during flooding events. If you've got sandy river entrances and things like that, and you're using a static bed with a tidal water level, you might get very high velocities predicted over the bed. In reality, it will scour out a bit. Which is probably a whole nother topic on sediment modeling.
Hey, look, that's been absolutely wonderful. Thanks everybody for your questions and comments and entering into the discussion. Bill, Chris, Phil, Shuang, just a great team. I've known these guys for over a decade, and I can assure you it's a team that is all about getting your best result. And you can see that today. Look, it's been a fantastic hour or so. We'll wrap it up here. The recording will be emailed out to you, upload to the website and YouTube channel. We do encourage you to do the survey that will pop up after you leave the webinar. Look at this. Tons of stuff coming up here in the next few months. Get on board because they're filling up fast. I was just talking to Joel earlier. Joel's the main driver here, and thanks, Joel, for all your work on this at the Australian Water School. And a big shout out to your team, Joe, Renee, Mark. They've done a wonderful job here. But there's the things you can look at: on-demand courses, webinars, and live courses. Go on the website, and you can hear all about it.
Actually, Trevor, before we close out,
Yep.
Just on that two-flow training link there, if you haven't used two-flow before, a couple of months ago we published an e-learning data set, which is actually free. So if you want to learn QGIS for two-flow modeling, or even just how to build a basic 2D model, those two e-learning modules are completely free. I highly recommend jumping on that link.
What a really good offer. I mean, QGIS and along with this training is going to be something really worthwhile. Okay, well, look, with that, I think we'll close this webinar bring this webinar to a close, and it's been a really great time. Thanks once again, Bill, for your great presentation. Chris, Phil, and Shuang for your effort working the Q&A. Answers for questions we haven't covered will come out after the webinar, and I think we have it all. Wonderful time together, everybody. Please join us again for the future on-demand courses, webinars, and live courses for the Australian Water School. Thanks again for joining us, and thanks again to each of the panelists and presenters.
Yeah,
See you next time.
Thank you, Trevor.
Thanks,
you very
Trevor.
much. Yeah.
Thanks, Trevor.
Thanks,
everyone for
Trevor.
joining.
Thanks, everyone.
Yep. Bye.
Thanks for watching. Subscribe by clicking the link below and click on the notification bell to stay up to date with new releases. For the latest in significant, innovative and critical advances in water science, technology and management, subscribe now. To build your skills, enhance your technical knowledge and learn from leading experts in water, visit theaustralianwaterschool.com.au and discover our online training courses, both live and on demand.